Hey, small group leaders, this is Chris coming to you with a Thanksgiving week group overview as we look at this week's lesson coming to us from 2 Kings 16 through 17. The title of this week's message is going to be, Is God's Judgment Justified? And Pastor Travis will be speaking this week, and he will be looking at 2 Kings 16 and 17 to answer this question. Getting into the digging deeper section of the lesson, we give you a brief summary of what's happening in 2 Kings 16 and 17, but the focus is really going to be on chapter 17, the fall of Israel. This is one of the great historic events we've been working towards over the last several weeks as we have been moving through the history of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And this week we see the fall of Israel in 722 BC at the hands of the Assyrian. And specifically looking at the question, why did Israel fall? And we see that there are 5 justifications that are given in chapter 7, why God was justified in judging Israel. The first, they disregarded the God of their redemption. And then secondly, they conformed themselves to the godless nations around them. And third, they practiced idolatry both openly and in secret. Number 4, they rejected the repeated warnings from God. And then finally, they forsook God and served idols until judgment finally came. As you look through these reasons here, I think you can see the thread of unfaithfulness, and we will dig deeper into that into the question coming up here. I give you kind of a trivia question. What does this chapter teach us about the Samaritans of the New Testament period of time? And this really kind of helps us understand the tension between the Jews and the Samaritans that we see in the gospel accounts and in Acts. These were essentially brothers, but there was a lot of animosity between them, and in many ways the Jews saw themselves superior. And I think as you read through this response and help guide your people through it, it's interesting to see how the roots of that go clear back to these Old Testament times. And this question, was God justified in his judgment of Israel? This is where we really dig into the reality of their unfaithfulness. And I think it's important to point out, as we do here, that as Christians, we can fall into the same trap that Israel fell into. We can grow comfortable in our quote, faithfulness. We can believe that we are being faithful to God when in truth we are anything but. We are far away from him. And we can see this being played out openly by the Israelites, but in many cases that could also be described the church today, as we see a church that is openly participating in worship and giving sacrificially and doing many of the things that we would consider to be Christian, but in truth our heart is far from God. And I think as we look at this, we can see that in reality, God despises this kind of unfaithfulness. This is something that is very repulsive to him. I gave you an example from Ezekiel 23 here that you can read through, and it's a graphic description, honestly, of how God views the unfaithfulness of Israel and Judah. And I think the text that seems to summarize this best comes from Amos, and Amos was a prophet to Israel in the years immediately in front of the fall of Samaria. So he would have been in the 20 to 30 years before the fall. And Amos, God says through Amos, he says, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That really gives us a picture of how God views unfaithfulness. There is no middle ground, and there is no way that we can pretend to be faithful to God when truly our hearts are far from him. As we transitioned into the second part of our lesson, we're going to look this week at chapter 4 from the book that we've been working through, The Church in Babylon. And this week it is The Church, Technology, and Purity. And so to get the conversation started, I've given you some examples of some of the benefits of living in a technologically advanced society. And just one that came to mind was the city of Phoenix. I had the opportunity to live in the Valley of the Sun when I was in college, and so this was a good reference for me to see that how it's taken place over the years. I think the thing that's stunning is that when you look at the city of Phoenix, and going back to the 1950s, Phoenix had fewer than 70,000 full-time residents. Why was that? It was because it's a desert city. It's very hot. I mean, you can't believe how hot it gets during the summer months, and there's no way that large populations could live there when the temperature is reaching into the 110 degree and above range day after day through the summer months. But in the 1950s, we began to see the emergence of air conditioning. And air conditioning changed everything. I mean, this one little technological advancement has allowed Phoenix to grow from a city of less than 70,000 people in the 1950s to today it's the fifth largest city in America with more than 1.6 million people. And so I think as you walk through this, you'll be able to see that there are a lot of advantages to technology that we are enjoying. And I've just given you several, and that will give you a place to start with your discussion. Another interesting fact is the reality that tech companies intentionally seek to create apps that are addictive to us. And I give you an article here from a former Google digital ethicist, and he writes how technology hijacks people's minds from a magician and Google design ethicist. In this article, he describes many of the ways that the tech companies design their apps to keep us coming back and to intentionally make them addictive so that we are constantly checking our apps and looking for updates and using their services. It reminds me of the tobacco companies that were sued several years ago for intentionally making the cigarettes more addictive to keep people smoking, even though they knew that cigarettes were bad for people's health and caused lung cancer, and yet these companies intentionally increased the elements within a cigarette that made it addictive. And this is exactly what the tech companies are doing today. There's a lot of evidence that overuse of technology is a problem, and yet the companies that are developing these apps are looking for ways to make them more addictive to us so that we keep coming back. The next question addresses the destructive impact of technology, and this is where we get into the issue of pornography and purity within America. And I've linked you to some articles, and if you go to the website, I've given you these direct links so you can go to these yourself. Just go into the website and click on the links, and it will take you right to the articles that we're talking about here. But this one article from author Tim Callis gives us 10 ugly numbers describing pornography use in 2017. And I think some of these are just astounding as we look at the reality that in 2016, people watched 4.6 billion hours of pornography at just one website. And he gives us some comparisons of how much time that is. That is 524,000 years of porn, or 17,000 complete lifetimes. These are astounding numbers. These are just unbelievable numbers that we're looking at here. Another one that should be alarming to parents is that at age 11, the average child has already been exposed to explicit pornography content through the internet. And then down below, we see 96% of young adults are either encouraging, accepting, or neutral in their view towards pornography. And this leads into the next question that we're looking at here. What is pornography doing to the moral compass in America? As we look at this, we realize that for the younger generation, it is, as Callis pointed out in his article, it's a neutral thing. And so we see that in America, and even within Christians, the use of pornography is losing its stigma, and that is a very unfortunate thing because it is something that is terribly destructive. I give you another link to an article here, and this is the article that Callie's got some of his stats from by George Barna, and it's called The Porn Phenomenon. And the reality here, just to give you an example of how this is impacting morality, most Americans believe porn is bad for society, but those attitudes are shifting towards neutrality or good for society among younger generations. Only small minority of adults who use porn report much guilt about porn. Teens and young adults view not recycling as more immoral than viewing pornography. So these should be alarming to us as a church and as families as we seek to help people who are being pulled into this trap. And this leads us into the next question, which is how is the church responding to the porn epidemic? And honestly, the church is not responding well. In fact, most churches don't respond at all. It's one of those deadly tsunamis that's heading toward the church the next few years. And I think most pastors feel helpless about confronting it, or worst of all, many pastors are involved in this themselves. And so there's a guilt factor that keeps them from addressing the issue openly. And so this is an area where the church is going to have to figure out how to help in this case. And at First Family Church, we do have a group that meets on Monday nights that is led by a couple men in our church, and it is specifically targeting those who are struggling with pornography. And if you're interested in getting more information about that, you can contact Paul Johnston, and I've given you his email address in the notes, and he would be happy to tell you more about that or how you can get connected in with that group. We then look at the question of what does the Bible say about technology and purity, and from this we rely on Erwin Lutzer's response, and I think he's spot on here when he compares it to the church of Thyatira in the 7 churches of Revelation, specifically of how they were permitting Jezebel. And we've learned a lot about Jezebel as we've studied through the book of 2 Kings and 1 Kings, and just what an evil woman she was. And so he draws that comparison to the church at Thyatira that had really become lax in how they viewed sexual sin, and allowing Jezebel, and the word he uses here that's used in Scripture is that they were tolerant of this woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, as in teaching, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality. And so in many ways, pornography is the modern day Jezebel. And if the church permits this, if the church begins to look the other way, this is going to be a great indictment against the modern church, and truly will put us in line with the church of Thyatira, which is not the church that we want to be identified with of the 7 churches. And so as we look through this, we have to realize that it is an issue, and it is something that we cannot take a sidestep with. But it is something that the Bible and Jesus call us to purity. Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And that is our memory verse for this week as we conclude this week's lesson. I've given you some resources here for parents, and again, you can access those by visiting the website. Just a couple things that will give parents some things to think about and to look for, and then, of course, for men specifically who are struggling with porn, this is an area that is worthy of the fight. And so we recommend a book, The Fight of Your Life, Manning Up to the Challenge of Sexual Integrity by Tim Clinton and Mark Laser. And that is the book that is recommended by our men's restoration group. And then there's some information about this Bible study that is for men who are struggling with porn. And again, the contact information for Paul Johnston if you want to get some more information. So that's a quick overview of this week's lesson. Sounds like it's going to be another one that will have a lot of interest for your groups. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback from the topics that we've been discussing this fall, and I think this is another one that is going to bring a lot of interest. And it's also one that, unlike several of the other topics, which are exterior challenges, things like immigration and gender identity issues, this one is going to hit close to home. And so again, just be sensitive as you're teaching through this and leading your group, and be sure to really connect them with the resources that are available. This is something that, as a church, we want to be on the front edge of instead of behind the eight ball, and it's something that we need to be aggressively working towards if we're going to see continued purity within the families of our church. Well, that's it for this week, group leaders. Again, I hope you have had a great Thanksgiving, and I hope that as we move into the month of December, you will intentionally just let your focus be upon the blessing of the birth of Christ and what that means to us, and take some time just to read through one of the gospel books and let that saturate your heart as we move through this, what can be a busy time for families. And let this be the focus of your Christmas season coming up as we move into the month of December. That's it. I hope you guys have a great week, and we will see you next week.